How to paint pumpkins in watercolors. Let's paint this vivid pumpkin painting with looser painting technique. First, let's prepare paper. I'm using cold pressed paper for this tutorial, and with the tape I'm applying little margin around the edge line of the paper, so after finishing this tutorial it will look like a little frame around the painting, which I really love when I painting the whole surface of the paper. So there's a little line around straight. Be sure that you apply this tape super straight and neatly press it down, and it looks like this. The outline drawing is done, which is available for download. I'm taking my elastic eraser, and as you can see, it is slightly dirty, but that's okay. If you squeeze it and differently bend it and stretch it, it will become cleaner. So I have this eraser for a very long time and it works perfectly, does the job as I need. Removing the excess amount of graphite off the paper to have a clean and neat outlines without any extra graphite marks visible. Now let's mix watercolors, adding water to my color palette and starting with Indian yellow, a little bit more of Indian yellow. For the second mix I'm using Indian yellow, quite dark and saturated watercolor mixes, mixing with round synthetic brush. To Indian yellow I'm adding Alizarin Crimson, and the third mix Indian yellow, more Indian yellow, and adding Perylene Maroon for more darker and more saturated mix for the shadow areas. We see that in the shadow those pumpkins are quite dark. And another extra is just lemon yellow, but that will be used at the very end. Mostly I'm painting with round synthetic brush and fine tip brush. This time I'm taking larger brush, and for applying water I'm taking the largest brush that I have, because we are painting quite large subjects and on an enlarged paper than usual my paintings are, and this is be much looser technique, painting technique, so I will be painting the whole pumpkin in one go for the first layer. Usually I go one section at a time, but this tutorial will be much looser technique, more freer. You can really express yourself, go with watercolors. Don't get worried about going over the edges, because later we will add darker backgrounds and we correct our mistakes. And starting with the middle pumpkin, starting from the shadow area, going with round synthetic brush. And this is just the first layer. As we can see from the reference, the reference should be really vivid and saturated at the end. The reference is very super dark and shiny pumpkins. We will have that, but we need to paint layers and layers with watercolors. Watercolors are quite transparent medium, so this is just the first layer, but I'm already establishing my darks and lights, also my color tones. The area around the outer edge is more darker. There I'm taking a mix of Indian yellow with Alizarin Crimson and adding a little bit of Indian yellow with Perylene Maroon and painting the outer edge. Also the very middle part where the center part is, there is also slightly darker area. Be careful, look really careful into your reference. Search for tonal values. in the first layers, it's important to establish tonal values. Don't get too worried about the right color mix. We will do that with layering, add more and more layers. Here I'm with clean and dry brush. I'm wiping out the pigment from the paper surface where the light is shining on the pumpkin surface. So I'm leaving that area light. And while the surface is still wet, I'm adding those lines, that sections which has pumpkin, the dividing lines of the sections, using Indian yellow with Perylene Maroon and painting with the very tip of the synthetic round brush. If you have those lines too dark in the first layer, you can smooth out with clean and dry brush. Don't get too worried about that. And this is more of a freer painting. There are no specific rules, just to try to make it transparent in the beginning, so you have room where to add those layers, because still we need to layer. That doesn't change in order to get a really realistic and vivid result. It will not be so detailed like the reference or like the other tutorials that I have, but still we have a realistic look, a very saturated, beautiful result with these pumpkins. Adding a little bit more to the outer edge, and we still now can see from the just first layer, which is super transparent at this point, but we can see some already three-dimensional look and roundness of this first pumpkin, because we did an outer edge a little bit darker, then the middle part is also slightly darker, then we have a lighter area. So it's important in the first layer to establish tonal values. Where are darks, where are lights, where are halftones, and adding some details already, like those dividing sections, those lines. My brush strokes are quite wide and very freely painting. I'm not too worried about perfection and super accuracy with outlines. This is much freer approach. Now let's move to another pumpkin. I will not be showing you the whole process of painting this whole surface of painting. It will take a really long time. So I will show you the technique and approach on a few pumpkins, and then some additional steps of painting different other pumpkins. Starting with water, the same as with the first pumpkin. The water is just enough for watercolors to be moved with the brush. Water isn't floating on by itself on the surface. There are no puddles, just enough so that watercolors can be moved with the brush, not by themselves. Starting from the shadow area again, taking Indian yellow with Alizarin Crimson and a little touch of Indian yellow with Perylene Maroon. Looking at reference for guidances, where are darks, where are lights, and again quite transparently and smoothly applying first layer. Technique is the same as with the first one and the other ones as well. It's just your observation skills of the reference. Open the reference right beside you so you can zoom each pumpkin individually and really study it. Take a look where are darks, where are lights, and apply these observations to your painting. I did some few pumpkins, as you can see, the same transparency, and now we can do another one together. A little pumpkin which is behind the big ones, more deeper into the composition. Still, technique is the same. Everything in the first layer is quite transparent. Nothing is too seen, which is further, which is closer, just it's a difference in sizes, but that we will establish later, what goes deeper, what goes closer to our eyesight. Now we're just painting first layers, establishing lights and darks, and that's it. With the same approach and technique, finish up the rest of the pumpkins for the first layer. Now the first layer for the whole composition is done, and starting to paint further the middle pumpkin that we have painted, the very first one, I'm applying a very transparent small amount of water to the pumpkin surface. I will be testing here different approaches. More smoother applying is when you apply water first and then you go with watercolors. Then you will have much smoother transitions from watercolor darker area to the lighter area. Also, I will be painting with going straight on the dry surface. It will create more texture. And here with the clean and dry brush, I'm smoothing the applied layer of watercolors. Here I'm going straight on the dry surface of the paper. I find that it works best for this tutorial to paint on a dry surface because I need to create also texture, not just apply layers of watercolors, but we can see from the reference that those pumpkins are quite textured, and painting on a dry surface will help me to build this texture for these pumpkins. Applying darker layer in the middle part. There we have a slight pumpkin surface going a little bit deeper into the middle part and creates the darkness surrounding that center part. Still looking at reference all the time, comparing and looking for new things that I can notice there, because the more we look, the more we start to see, the more we start to notice new tonal values, some textures, some details, some color tones. And during this painting tutorial, I will be mixing more and more watercolors on my color palette with the same pigments, and I'm not scared of running out of pigment, running out of watercolor mixes, and I always encourage my students to don't make big watercolor mixes, too saturated. It's okay that your watercolor mix can finish, and during painting you know which pigments you pre-mix, so you take the same pigments and mix again. And if the watercolor mix slightly changes from the previous one, that's completely okay. Your painting will only benefit if you will have slightly different color tones with the same pigments. That is completely okay, and your painting will look much richer, more vivid, and more natural, because in real life, in one subject we have so many different color tones, and that is completely okay if your painting will also have some different color tones, but with using the same pigments. And the more you will mix, the more you will practice watercolor mixes, the more you will start to learn and feel much freer in mixing watercolors. Here I'm adding more darker, more richer of Indian yellow watercolor mix to this pumpkin. Painting with a bigger synthetic brush, which I usually don't use. This is very rarely occasion that I use a bigger synthetic brush, but this is quite a large and much looser painting. Perfect for this time of season and gives a very nice, smooth, big brush strokes for these pumpkins. Adding darker lines to dividing sections. And more darkness on the surrounding area of this pumpkin. We still need to get more darkness on the outer edge to create this illusion of roundness. Now let's continue with the second pumpkin. Technique is the same, approach is the same. only that I'm painting on a dry surface, going straight with watercolors, using bigger round synthetic brush and starting from the darker area, moving towards the lightest part. Washing my brush and smoothing the applied layer. Washing my brush and cleaning in paper towel so it's not completely, water isn't dripping from the brush. It is moist but not super wet. Smoothing the applied watercolor layer and moving forward. Adding lines to dividing sections of the pumpkin with the very tip of my bigger round synthetic brush. The tip is quite thin, so I'm creating these nice lines with this quite big watercolor brush. Washing my brush, cleaning in paper towel, and I can smooth the applied lines so they are not super crisp with crisp edges, but one edge is more crisper of the brush stroke and the other one I'm smoothing, creating this transition from darker to lighter. We can see that in reference that each dividing section has one edge is crisp and the other one is smoothly going from the darker to the lighter part. And adding darker layer of watercolors around the middle part. Now let's move forward. As you can see, I did the same technique for the other pumpkins, and now using Indian yellow clean pigment, I'm adding this Indian yellow to the whole pumpkin, the first one that we painted. I need more yellowish color to my pumpkins, as I can see from the reference that they are super bright yellow orangey color. And to create this, I'm layering. Again, it's all about layering, even with realistic, more detailed painting. And here I'm layering different color tones, and they all will end up with this very realistic and vivid result. Still, my layer of Indian yellow pigment is quite transparent. I'm not painting with super saturated watercolors. They will only block the light and all the layers previously. So I'm painting quite transparently. With round synthetic brush, adding big and wide brush strokes for this painting. Now let's add a dark background in those little areas that are still white. Mixing new watercolor mix, adding Perylene Violet, more Perylene Violet, to make it darker I'm adding Indigo. It will create a really dark and saturated watercolor mix. Adding more Indigo, adding more Perylene Violet. It's very dark violet color right now. And I'm also adding Indian Yellow to this watercolor mix to make it more friendlier with the other pumpkins, so it's not just violet, it's yellowish violet and more like brownish violet, so it's perfect for the first layer of this background color, which is quite dark and saturated. And with the synthetic brush I'm carefully painting this background, and I'm instantly, as I apply this color, this quite dark color, I'm correcting the outlines, the outer edges of the pumpkins, because I was painting quite fast and with big brush strokes, and I went over the edges of the pumpkins. And now I can, with a darker, by applying darker watercolor layer, I can correct my outlines of the pumpkins. And also I'm looking in the reference and noticing that some pumpkins that are deeper in the composition are going like into that darkness of the background. So I'm painting a little bit over the edges of the darker parts of those pumpkins and smoothing the edge line and the background slightly together. So I'm making them looking and positioning them deeper into the composition by applying this darker edge line to that area which is in the background. Separating these two pumpkins with this darker color, and instantly, while the layer is still slightly wet, I'm washing my brush, cleaning in paper towel and smoothing that layer. We can see from the reference that these pumpkins are divided with a quite dark line, dark area of the shadow, and this color is perfectly for that. Also adding another layer of some darker brush strokes. I'm constantly looking at reference and noticing which pumpkins are more deeper in the composition, which are darker, and now I'm building that darkness, separating these pumpkins, making some pumpkins go deeper and further from our eyesight, and some stay more closer to us. Those bigger frontline pumpkins they will become closer to our eyesight as we move those ones which are in the background more deeper into the composition. Now let's paint the stem part of the pumpkins. Stems are little tiny left stems, and adding to my background color mix Perylene Green, and with the tip of the brush, very loosely, not super detailed, I'm painting that stem area. Still looking to the reference for some guidances, but I'm not aiming for the accuracy that I see there. I'm keeping everything quite simple and loose. Now I'm adding Indian yellow to my color palette, and to Indian yellow I'm adding Sennelier Red for more richer orangey color for these pumpkins. The surface is completely dry at this moment, and I'm painting the pumpkins that are more deeper in the composition. I'm painting them more darker, and also will be adding details to the pumpkins in front. Still, my painting compared to the reference is quite pale, so this watercolor mix will definitely bring more saturation to this painting. Using the same watercolor mix Indian yellow and adding Sennelier Red. and painting on a dry surface, creating also texture, not just another watercolor layer, but also texture. I'm not smoothing too much now, as I'm approaching more to the detailing stage of this painting. I'm not smoothing here because I need that texture. Also, cold pressed paper at this point is helping me to create this texture. On a dry surface, placing my brush more parallel to the paper surface, and the rough surface of the cold pressed paper is helping me create this texture. On a hot pressed paper it wouldn't be so easy because it's completely smooth, but here the cold pressed paper is helping me to create texture. And as you can see, this watercolor mix instantly gives more richer look to our painting. And adding another layer to some more deeper pumpkins, making them more darker, and they are now going deeper into composition, and we can see how pumpkins are separating one from each other. I use the same approach, the same technique for the whole painting for all pumpkins, and as you can see, it becomes more and more richer, more and more three-dimensional, because we are leaving the lightest parts light and making those darker areas more contrasty, more darker, and those pumpkins that are behind the big ones, they are going more deeper into the composition. Still looking at reference, still noticing where I need to add more darkness to build more contrast, and another layer of watercolors. Adding Indian yellow and painting straight with Indian yellow to the painting. Now I'm zooming out, taking my biggest brush, adding water to color palette, and taking lemon yellow, adding more lemon yellow to my color palette. Also a little bit more water, so this watercolor is more watery than the previous ones, and glazing over the whole area of the pumpkins. I'm giving this more brighter yellow layer, and as you can see, they're like shining right now. This lemon yellow gives a final very vivid touch to these pumpkins, and I'm doing it very roughly, very with big brush strokes, and my layer is very transparent, quite watery. The surface underneath is completely dry. Be sure that the surface underneath is completely dry, so you are not lifting out or smudging the watercolor layers right now. You are glazing over the completely dry surface, and this lemon yellow gives a really nice touch to the whole painting. I noticed that I need to lift out some just applied layer, especially to those areas where we have a shiny area on the pumpkin surface. So while it's still wet, I can freely wipe out the pigment, so I have those lighter areas light. Adding Perylene Maroon with Indian yellow to my color palette, and with the tip of the brush adding those darker lines to the separation areas of the pumpkins. Now we can add details, we can paint more. If you like, you can go more into detailing, more into layering, more into add darkness to the background. This is the time that you can really go on and paint and make it more realistic, more detailed. I'm quite happy with the result. This is a really nice sometimes to take a little break from really detailed paintings and paint something a little bit looser, but still in the same technique, but just a little bit freer and looser. This gives a nice feeling, a nice break from really concentrating on small details with the finest brushes. I like sometimes to take free paintings of more freer style, more looser techniques. And now a final touch is to remove the tape that we applied in the very beginning. When you are removing, don't rush things. Be very careful. Be sure that your painting is dry. Remove tape really slowly by pulling away from your painting. This is very important. Pull away from your painting and be careful that you are not tearing off some parts of your paper. Do it slowly, accurately, and everything will be just perfect. I really enjoyed painting this tutorial. Hope you learned something new. This is quite different from my usual paintings, but hope you enjoyed this painting. See you in my next tutorials. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting, and like and subscribe. Bye.